Hello and welcome everyone joining us on Facebook or Zoom to this exciting panel discussion on racism and minority issues. European political leaders in conversation. For those of you who are new to EUJS, EUJS, the European Union of Jewish Students, is an umbrella organisation of 36 Jewish student unions from across Europe and is the democratic and peer-led representation of roughly 160,000 young Jews. I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of senior representatives of some of the youth wings of various political groups in the European Parliament. And on this note, I feel it is important to point out that I say some of the youth wings as EUJS has consciously decided not to invite the far-right representation. Joining us today are Antoaneta Asanova, the president of the European Liberal Youth Organisation, LIMEC, Carlo Angrisano, chairman of the European Democrat Students' Organisation, EDS, Mina Tolu, spokesperson of the Federation of Young European Greens, and Michelle Rauschkolb, vice president of the Young European Socialists. Thanks to each of you for joining this debate. A couple of last things from me before we begin. For those in the audience, I'd encourage you to send in questions via the Q&A function on Zoom or in the comment section of the Facebook live stream. And if we have time, I will put your questions to our panel. And finally, we are framing this as a debate, so to our panelists, be respectful, but please feel free to jump in, comment on and disagree with what other panelists have said. So without further ado, I think it would be quite useful to briefly get more of an understanding of the organisations that you're representing. Many of those watching this discussion will likely be familiar with the political groups in the European Parliament. So the EPP group, the Greens, S&D, Renew Europe, and so on. Antoaneta, perhaps I could start with you by asking you what the relationship is between LIMEC and Renew Europe, for instance. How much work do you do with the European Parliament, and how should we view LIMEC and Renew as part of the same organisation or perhaps two distinct entities?
Thank you very much. Well, I'll start by saying a few words on LIMEC as an organization. We're a rather old organization. LIMEC was created in 1976. By now, it contains 61 organizations coming from 39 countries from not only the European Union, but also the European continent at large, so also EU's neighborhood. We also, being liberals, we believe a lot in the power of the individual. That's why we also have an individual members section. So you don't necessarily need to be a member of a youth organization or political party in your country. You can be a member of LIMEC on your own merit. So LIMEC is the youth organization of the ALDE party, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats in Europe. And it's also affiliated with the Renew Europe group, as you correctly pointed out. We have members of the Renew Europe group that are not members of the ALDE party, and hence we only represent the young voices of a certain amount of the members of the Renew Europe group, albeit about 2/3 of the Renew Europe group. We work in a spirit of great cooperation. We share obviously the same ideas. The way we see the role of a youth organization is always, of course, to be the stone in your shoe, the uncomfortable youth whip when we perceive ourselves as the beam of light of what is principally correct. As you know, as youth organization, we don't have per se voters that are, parties have directly. So we can have the freedom of critical thinking, of shedding the direction and aspiring for more, building what we do on hope for a better liberal Europe.
Thank you, Antoaneta. And I'll very much leave the floor open if any of the other representatives would like to speak on a contextual basis around your youth organisation before we crack on with the discussion on racism and minority issues. Carlo, perhaps you'd like to add something?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thank you, Ilan, for organizing such an interesting panel discussion. I believe that this is most probably right now one of the most urgent topics to be discussed among youngsters like us. Let me just briefly introduce EDS to everyone that is new, that is not familiarized with our organization. EDS is the Student Association of the European People's Party. It was founded in 1961. I believe that it's important also to highlight that we have very important alumni among my predecessors, among the former chairman, like Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, or even Carl Bildt. We represent nowadays approximately 1.6 million students across Europe with, I would say that we are an organization of organizations. So we have approximately 50 member organizations that represent more or less 40 countries across Europe. And also we have organizations that come from our eastern southern borders, and we are open also to some global discussions. We have right now events going on every year, also in Latin America, in Asia, in the Middle East. And just briefly to mention a bit our fundamental values, our statutory values maybe, we represent organizations that are close to liberalism, to conservatism, and to Christian democracy. So these are the three pillars or ideological pillars of our organization. And that's a bit the presentation of EDS with regards of the EPP and the institutions. We are an official member association, so we are registered also towards the European Parliament. And of course, we work and we cooperate very closely with our MEPs and with our political family.
Thank you very much, Carlo. And perhaps I can now, for Michelle and Mina, you'll also get the opportunity to introduce your organizations, but perhaps I can introduce the first question to the debate, and you could speak about your organizations in to that end. So in moving the conversation towards the specific topics of racism and minority issues, I'd be interested to get to know how your organizations engage in these issues, what the major challenges that you generally face are, and as well, if you could perhaps speak to the recent trend of, or the ongoing coronavirus crisis, how this has impacted on your work, if at all, both in terms of the focus of your work and the methodology. So Mina, perhaps I'll pass over to you.
Hi. Well, do I get the chance to perhaps introduce the Federation of Young European Greens? Yes, quickly.
Of course. Yes. I meant it in the sense of if you could introduce it as well and continue with the conversation on racism.
Absolutely. Okay, well, to start with, FYG is the Federation of Young European Greens. We're representing over 36 member organizations. They're either youth wings of Green political parties or Green organizations, from Azerbaijan to Ireland, from Norway to Malta. And as like many of the other organizations here today and federations, we organize a number of trainings. We share knowledge, but we are also extremely political and active also on the European level. And so our work relates to the European Green Party. We are their official youth wing. And beyond that, we also work very closely with the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament. And particularly, we collaborate with the young MEPs in the Greens EFA group, like Kim van Sparntak, Misha Blas, Rasmus Andersen, Kira. These are also, some of them are alumni of FYG and former co-spokespersons of FYG, Ska Keller and Terry Reintke as well. And so this is really exciting to have this close collaboration with such strong voices in the European Parliament calling for a social, sustainable, welcoming, feminist and inclusive Europe. And so we're very, very excited to have this be part of our history, so to say. When it comes to racism and engaging with the topic of like minority issues, FYG has been mostly and particularly vocal on refugee rights, as we see. I think the topic of migration comes up often, of course, on a European level, and it is worrying to see the inaction from Europe on migration. This Dublin system, which doesn't work. We need a fair alternative for that, and this is why we work closely and campaign on this, and have passed as a political platform a number of resolutions on migration, but also in the past also on Roma rights. And we look beyond Europe when we look to Western Sahara, participating and also encouraging our members to debate on Palestine and Israel, and so on. But we do try to also allow for that space for political debate amongst all our members, and for them to bring their resolutions to our General Assembly every year. And the same way we make sure to bring important debates to the Council of the European Green Party. And just last week, we pushed for and supported a Black Lives Matter resolution at the European Green Party Council, which passed, I almost have to say obviously, but which is very strong in calling for more than solidarity and just words and hashtags, but also, concrete actions, and particularly for those political parties in Europe, that the green parties in Europe that have power at different levels of government, they actually have time. Now it's time for them to show action and to put action behind the words of the Greens in the past, and show that the Greens will be an anti-racist force across Europe. I'll stop there for now. I'll go into a bit more of these topics, I'm sure, later on a variety of these areas. So thank you, and thanks for inviting FYG into this panel.
Absolutely, thank you, Mina, and you're absolutely right. We will delve deeper into these issues going forward. Michelle, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, thanks again for inviting us here. Maybe I'll say a few words about YES in the beginning. YES is an organization. It's called actually the Young European Socialists. We are the umbrella organization of social democratic and socialist youth organizations in Europe. We have over 60 members within Europe, but also from the Middle East. We were founded in 1992, which is quite late, basically. And yeah, we do a lot of educational work. We have different networks who are working on policies, like a queer and feminist network, one on democracy in the fight against the far right, and one on education. And yeah, try to bring people from different countries to exchange and connect with each other. When it comes to minority rights, I mean, my portfolio is migration. So in the past, we've been working a lot together with sea rescue organizations and migrant support organizations. We did a campaign during Corona times regarding Moria, because I think like what we're seeing right now, a lot of people are calling it like a migration crisis, but what it really is a solidarity crisis that we see in Europe. And as solidarity is one of the pillars of what we are fighting for as Young European Socialists, with equality and a strong labor movement, it's very dear to our hearts to be fighting for those people who are living in those camps in really dire situations, conditions right now. And of course, another community I think that needs a lot of support right now that we're backing is the queer and LGBTIQ community. Especially in Eastern Europe. I mean, what we're seeing in Hungary and in Poland, where this crisis is actually exploited to push through ideology. I think, yeah, it's needed to connect activists there and to have support campaigns.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and as well for touching on a few different issues there, highlighting very important topics. Antoinetta, I'll pass over to you now for your experiences with LIMIC.
Thank you. Well, where do I start? We have extensive policy within the European Liberal Youth Organization when it comes to safeguarding civil rights, minority rights, anti-racism. In fact, today I just did the test of seeing how many times we have in our policy book the word anti-discrimination, and it turns out it's the exact number of 102. So this can give you enough of a picture about where our policy stands, which is quite understandable because the basic principle of liberalism is, freedom and responsibility. And freedom implies equal rights, but also equal opportunities, getting to the same result. So we have been striving to do this, not only through our policy, which as well we bring to the level of our mother party, ALDE, but also in the European Parliament, but as well last year at our autumn Congress in London, we adopted an internal regulation of our organization, the Equality and Diversity Plan, which goes in, it's a very thorough description of what we do as an organization in our internal structures, in the way we function as an employer, but also in the way we organize events, in the way we distribute even tasks between bureau member, so much so that we provide a space of equality, an equal space to our members and our structures to be seen and heard. Other than that, we just now, during the Corona times, have launched, or rather relaunched, a working group that is specifically targeted on identifying policies and looking for solutions on civil and minority rights. In addition, in the upcoming days, we're going to be having an event with the Council of Europe on the topic Hear Me Out, Take Me In. It's quite obvious the direction of this. Initially, it's the first time we do a Council of Europe project like that. Initially, it was intended to be a 5-day training. As you said, Corona impacted the way we function, and we had to turn it into an online training, but it's targeted at both communication officers and policy officers within the youth organization, so that you give them a tool set of how not just to speak about how equality and diversity is important, but to actually be able to streamline with their actions, to actually be able to project it properly and thus attract more diversity. In terms of challenges, we meet in that area. It's, well, it's quite obvious. The structures are in place, but we still don't have the level of diversity, I would say, that you would aspire to have in such a multifaceted, multicolored, multi-religious and diverse Europe. You would guess that more young people of a different origin would be interested in mainstream politics. So this is maybe a challenge that needs tackling, and that's why we're doing the Council of Europe training, so that we can attract more diversity and have it not just in our policies but in practice.
Great, thank you for your intervention. And Carlo, same question to you. What's the framework of EDS engagement on this topic?
Well, Ilan, thanks for giving me the floor. But first of all, I didn't want to make this remark so that we wouldn't spice up the debate so soon. But I heard in the beginning of the debate that according to I don't know whose standards, the far-right groups were not invited. I don't know exactly which political parties were discriminated, but I certainly believe that democracy is built on pluralism, and especially debates among youngsters. We don't have to be afraid of others' opinions. If it was not the case, I maybe wouldn't be here. And I am so certain that I have a good understanding of the situations that I'm ready to face whoever's opinion. So first of all, let me do this remark as a general comment.
Sure. Carlo, perhaps I could just comment on that and then pass it back over to you. Yes. As EUGS, we tend not to, or we don't engage with the Identity and Democracy Party, the far-right political group in the European Parliament, based off of and based off of anti-Semitic sentiment, racist sentiment, anti-migration, anti-refugee sentiment, and that's generally a policy for us. So while we do agree that engagement is good, there needs to be limits placed on that, and providing a platform to organizations with racist tendencies is something that we try to avoid.
Of course, but as I don't know exactly which political parties have been left out, I cannot understand exactly who has been considered as far right. I don't know if ECR, which is a quite large group that represents a lot of governments in Europe, has been left out. I'm not sure. So this was just a comment and a strong stance on pluralism. This doesn't mean that we share their views. It means that we only would have preferred to have a more plural debate. Secondly, I wanted to quickly address a very young president, head of state in Europe that is certainly inspiring a lot of people and inspired myself 2 days ago with his speech to the nation. And I want to quote Mr. Macron when he said that communitarianism is not the solution. Certainly, now after the lockdown, after the quarantine, there is right now a social explosion, and in some places of Europe and the US, we are seeing how these topics are being brought back. And definitely, to us, the first and foremost fundamental issue is that everyone should be treated as an equal. And we don't believe in communitarianism. We don't like to tag people. To us, every single citizen has the same rights, has the same value, and must be treated as an equal. Nevertheless, it is true that there are a lot of minority issues in Europe that still need to be treated, because as long as we have minority issues, we will not be ready to treat everyone as an equal. This means that there are some ethnicities, some religious minorities that are not equally treated in their countries. Right now, there are approximately 60 million European citizens who are defined as an ethnic or religious minority. That makes up around 12% of the total. That's a very large proportion of the European population. And let me point out, EDS has been working very closely to help these communities, to help these minorities to be respected and to have their rights respected in their countries. One of the largest minorities in the European Union, for instance, is the Hungarian minority. There are Hungarian minorities in a lot of countries, like Romania, where they represent 6% of the population. And this is why EDS has been calling on the European institutions, the Parliament, the Commission, to create, first of all, a unified system and set of laws to protect European minorities and their rights. For us, this is fundamental. This is a first step towards real equality among the citizens. Secondly, we called upon them to protect the rights of European minorities to receive their education in their own language. Right now, I'm here in Barcelona, in my hometown, where I had to study in a French school because I didn't have the right to study in my own language. And these are concrete issues that we would like to tackle all together. Then we also called on these institutions to create a unified solution to safeguarding the history, symbols, and traditions of European minorities. Right now, I believe that we will be discussing about this later on with one of the next points in the agenda of this debate. This is something also very important for us. And lastly, we want that the rights of all European minorities are respected also in higher education and university institutions. And again, I am here in Barcelona, where the students' rights were not always protected, and it is not the only case in Europe. There has been a lot of targeting on some students, and we want this to end. Universities must be a place of freedom. Well, the name is self-explanatory, universitas. This must be a place of pluralism, of debate, of openness, and not of exclusion. So this would sum up a bit our positions. I know that I have right now spiced up the debate, but it's good for the sake of democracy that we can have open debates and confront also the matters where we not necessarily agree on.
May I say something on that last part, first and last part? Whereas I'm a very, very strong proponent of diversity and all the voices be heard out when we talk about extreme right and right-wing populists. I don't believe that giving them more visibility and more platform to spread out hate is the right way forward. In the country that I know best, Bulgaria, where I come from, unfortunately, we have a government with the participation of the extreme right forces. They also participate in parliament and in the leadership of the national parliament, of course. This is a terrible example of how a platform can spur more rhetoric of hate, and then hate becomes so much so the language of those in power that it becomes completely normal and normalized in everyday life. A vice prime minister at some point of this government turned to the representatives of the Roma people, saying they are anthropoids and their women have instincts of stray bitches. I mean, this is completely unacceptable in a modern day European rhetoric. So I honestly don't see with what other than spreading the language of hate would an extreme right participant help out to discuss, the issues of race and equality. Their target point, what they will say.
May I ask you one question, Antoinetta? Well, first of all, look, also in my country, we have extreme left in power right now. We have Podemos that is in power, that is an extreme left party that has been funded by a dictatorship, Venezuelan dictatorship. And they have the support of former terrorist organizations right now in the Spanish government. Am I in favor of forbidding them from doing politics? No, because they were voted by the people. What I'm in favor is that we, democratic organizations, have a better voice and convince people to vote for us, to sustain our ideas. But I will never be afraid of them. I will never be afraid of having a debate with them, because first and most important thing is that they also represent people, equal citizens. Someone that votes for Podemos has the same value to me that someone that votes for my political party. And this is a very strong message that we need to show to the population if we want to stop polarization. We need these political parties to come back to centrality. We need them to be integrated again in the democratic life. Otherwise, we will keep polarizing the situation. It's like the history of socialism. They had to turn from Marxism to social democracy to be integrated in a democratic system. And we want this to happen also with extreme left and extreme right. And this is why I was astonished from the lack of pluralism in that sense.
However, would you really amplify a clear language of hate? People don't recognize Roma people as equal human beings.
If they only
think that there is any value in hearing that point of view? You see any value in spreading this out?
They are voted by people.
I'm going to ask Mina.
I'll just pop in to directly respond to Carlo, although I think that we're kind of deviating now the whole reason why we are here to discuss and perhaps also come to some agreement on what Europe needs to be doing to fight racism. I'm sure that amongst us, we have some clear ideas of how to go forward. And I think, Carlo, that it is ludicrous to expect the European Union of Jewish Students to invite the far right to discuss on their platform what they think of racism and minority issues. Right. If this was another platform, if you were organizing the debate, by all means, there are plenty of spaces where we can discuss with the far right. This is not it, and definitely also this is not the issue I would want to be discussing with them. And this, I think it's insensitive to suggest that. I'm sure Michelle has a lot to say on your comment on socialism and Marxism. Again, I don't think this is the space for that, but definitely I think this is sidelining the core reason why we are here today, to discuss minority issues, to discuss racism, and to discuss minority issues beyond what you were saying, that, you know, like these minorities are not actual minorities because there are so many of us in Europe. So again, I think it's unfortunate for the debate to be sidelined in this way, just because there was a very clear statement made that the far right did not come, and I think it's such an important statement to be made.
This is why I raised the question, because I was not aware that some political parties were not included, and I don't know who is the far right. And it was just a fair question, because when we are debating forums and the people that debates, it's very important, especially if we want to give some solution to the people that is listening to us.
By all means, when you're organizing a debate, when your National Youth Council is organizing a debate, and so on, that if the European Union of Jewish Students is organizing a debate today, they decide who to invite to the debate. And I think that is
absolutely.
Thank you for raising the point, Carlo. And I want to ask Michelle to come in to give her view on what's been said.
No, actually, like there's like the other women on this panel have actually said before what I wanted to say. So yeah, I would just be careful with comparing Marxists, and I would call myself a Marxist, and socialists, or even Podemos, with far-right parties who are anti-Semitic and racist, and this is not the same, and this will never be the same, and I'm actually really tired of these discussions.
Thanks for your comment, Michelle, and perhaps let's keep the conversation going. Well, Carlo, I'm sorry to cut you off, but we'll keep the conversation going at this point. I want to perhaps let's talk about this area. In recent times, the very core of the EU has been severely challenged. Brexit has illustrated a revival in renewed Euroscepticism, and the coronavirus crisis has shown the almost knee-jerk reaction of European states to look inwards via border closures and increased securitization. Many political commentators, for instance, view this as a failure of the EU, as has been alluded to before. Perhaps, Michelle, I could come to you on this. What's your assessment of the future of the EU, and how do you believe the European project can be revived, so to speak?
I would say that this crisis has actually shown that normal was a crisis, and that it has reinforced the dynamics that we've had before in the European Union. I mean, we see when we're talking about recovery bonds and the discussion around this issue, that a lot of countries are just acting as if they were representing their own countries and not in terms of solidarity and helping each other out. And I think this is very, as I've said before, there is a solidarity crisis, and this means not just in terms of migration, but also in terms of helping each other, helping those countries who are affected much more than others during this crisis. And I mean, how we can come together, I think it has to do something with giving up privilege for a lot of countries, and sharing some of their privilege.
Thanks, Michelle. And if anyone else has a comment to make, feel free to jump in. Antoinetta, are you? Yeah.
No, I was thinking maybe this time we can reverse the order and have Mina and Carlo and I'll go last, because I was going first the first two times.
Sure.
To have
if that's all right with you.
In how we do this.
Right. When I hear Brexit, it's scary. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind when I think about Brexit, while all of that was happening, I was working with Transgender Europe, and one thing we noted was the sudden increase in hate speech towards trans people in the UK during Brexit. It was like that whole the kind of discourse around Brexit actually fueled other hate discourse towards other groups. And now as an LGBTQI activist as well, and as a trans person, I did notice also that increased hate towards trans people that we're starting to see also nowadays. And so it's interesting to see how hate brews hate, and how harmful those discourses can be. And therefore, when I'm thinking ahead in Europe, and I'm thinking of like those harms that Brexit brought, and also kind of the discussions across Europe, like as European Greens, as a Federation of Young European Greens, we do believe that the European Union needs to do better, in particular for minorities. There's the EU has not done enough, for instance, on migration. The EU, the European Council has been blocking, for instance, also the anti-discrimination directive since 2008. All of these things, when we discuss minority issues, like should be taken into consideration. There's so many changes that need to be made. But definitely in the context of talking about hate, and talking about hate against minorities and racism, there was a clear statement with Brexit that hate was okay, because the hate that I was talking about, an increase of hate against trans individuals, but there was also an increased amount of xenophobia against also EU nationals, Polish people, Hungarians who are working in the UK. And to this day, we see that still in the UK. And so you see the long-term effects of a campaign of hate and how dangerous that could be. And so clearly the EU needs to do more to listen to people on the ground. And part of that is structural. I think a lot of people feel that Europe, this big idea that is Europe, is distant from us. And one of those things is something that the Greens bring up every 5 years, brought it up most recently last year, is that people need to elect the president of the parliament ourselves. Like, it's not up to the states to elect, well, now it's von der Leyen, but that should be in the hands of the people as well. Like, our highest representative in Europe should be elected by the people. And I think that it's important to also start thinking about the structures in Europe. Again, when it comes to the racism and minority issues, when you look at the European Parliament at the moment, and you hear the stories of Black members of the European Parliament, you hear about, for example, Mathieu, the Black MEP from the UK, that on his first day at work at the Parliament in Brussels last July was asked to leave because they could not believe he was an MEP. You hear other stories from Black and people of color who are MEPs or parliamentary assistants. And so it really gives this understanding that this is a system that has been built by white people, and therefore it will serve white people, and the kind of long-term impact of having such a system is dangerous, and we need to contend with it, and we need to actively seek solutions to have a better system in place, to also platform, as Michelle was saying, and to give space and to give voice to minorities, and do our best also to support and help politicians from diverse backgrounds, be it sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, or religion background. Like, we need more diverse and more representative European Parliament, and then hopefully we can start to actually address some of the problems we have in Europe that led to Brexit.
Thank you, Mina. And Carlo, over to you for your assessment on the future of Europe.
Well, Ilan, definitely Europe is right now in a historical crossroads, and we need to decide how do we want to construct this common project that we have in our hands. We must say that this is one of the most important historical periods since the end of World War II. You know that Europe is what is bringing peace to our European Union. The European Union is what is bringing peace to our continent. For us, this is a pillar. We cannot think of less European Union in the future, especially in times of crisis. We need more solidarity among member states. We need better coordination as well, because one of the things that we have witnessed at the beginning of the crisis, and I believe also that one of the triggerings of all of these these pandemic in Italy, in Spain, was not following the recommendations of the Commission. So definitely we believe that on the health side, we need more and better coordination. And this is one of the reforms that we believe the European Union should go under. We should analyze exactly what is the role of the European Council. And I believe that everyone here will agree that the European Council needs to be reformed and that we need to give more power and more resources to the Commission and also to the Parliament, so that the Parliament cannot be shut down. I think that there is a very nice quote from one of the vice chairmen of the EPP group in the European Parliament, who said that in times of pandemics, the parliaments were the hospitals of democracy. And this is why we have saw that it was very scary to see how in some countries like Spain, the rule of law was suspended during this pandemic, and that there was also, well, you know, an increase in some of these radical views, like, you know, in Spain, the radical left leans a lot to racism, and there were a lot of insults against some black MPs that come from center-right parties, um, coming from Bardem families, comparing them to Uncle Tom. So here, if I start, I could explain a bit more about the situation right now in Spain, where there is a lot of aggressivity in politics, a lot of tension, and we believe that this is a time for unity and a time for, well, as I mentioned, solidarity. There were a lot of cases of countries that were almost hijacking the efforts made by other countries. I don't want to finger point any European country, but both Spain and Italy suffered from that. There were a lot of their health resources of the things you need to fight the pandemic that were blocked in European airports, and this is something that we cannot have again. Something that we don't want to witness again ever. Definitely, right now, we must be aware that the epidemiology dangers are very serious, and we should treat them as they are. And it's something that can put us out of the global players. I mean, there are a lot of the impact also on the security field is terrible. NATO was planning one of the biggest military exercises ever in its history during these last few months, and it was almost suspended because of this crisis, which leaves us in a very weak situation with regards of the other global players, and especially the inactivity of Europe at a global level, where during this pandemic, a lot of regimes have taken profit to, you know, undermine even more the weaker position that they have. And I'm thinking of Latin America right now, but also of a lot of African regimes and Asian regimes. So there is a lot to be done. We need to analyze how was our reaction. We need to also point at the you know, the good aspects. I believe that if you compare the reaction of Europe with the reaction of other countries or other continents, we were much better. When we talk about education, for example, I believe that the European Digital Education Action Plan has worked quite well given the circumstances. Of course, there is a lot to be done. There is now an opportunity to rethink Europe. There is right now an opportunity to make a new Europe that will face all of these challenges that we have. And to do this, we need to have these open discussions. We need to reach other political families. We cannot keep thinking about next election, but we need to start thinking about the next generation. And it is hard to see when one is young.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Sorry for cutting you off there.
Course.
we've got so many more points and questions coming in from the audience, so I'll pass over to Antoinetta now.
I'll pick at one of Carlos' last points in terms of Europe being more active on the global stage as part of the future of Europe. In order this to happen, Europe has to act with one voice. And it's quite obvious that things cannot continue the way they're now. That is why at LIMEC we have convened the presidents of our youth organizations and the individual members to come up with ideas of what exactly is not functioning well with Europe from an institutional point of view, in order to map the future discussion that we want to have on what Europe we want to live in. And while we are on what Europe we want to live in, I will come back to something Mina said, that clearly the EU needs to do more and to listen. And I'll bring us back to the specific topic of today's discussion. I cannot agree more. We definitely need to do more and to listen, because one of the systemic issues when we talk about race, when we talk about discrimination and not equal opportunities, is exactly the fact that the legal basis, the legal framework is there. We have, I don't know, a constitution of a European country that doesn't prohibit discrimination on the basis of ABCD. However, what we're seeing is discrimination in practice, because what Martin Luther King fought for people to have the framework, to have it the rights provided, is just the first step on the road. The second step is providing the same opportunities that lead us to the same result. Because having just the same rights doesn't mean that you reach the same results. There are studies, including field studies, according to which people sitting at an interview, when you submit 2 or 3 different applications with the exact same credentials of the people, but just with names that speak out for diversity, those people get less of a percentage of callback from employers. And that is, the study was made in the UK, one of the societies in Europe that are, you know, a bit, you would presume, with a bit more developed sense of equality. What can we say about the rest? In fact, if you could spotlight the little paper that I provided you with. Thank you very much. So this is a study by the FRA, by the Fundamental Rights Agency. As you can see, it's a very, very small infographic. As you can see, we definitely need to do more. The title, the overall outcome, is widespread racism continues to plague Europe. This is not okay. I was watching the US protests, and I saw a woman in her 70s, more or less, who was holding a sign, I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit. We're representatives of youth organizations. We should not wait another 60 years to see those numbers get changed. I mean, one third of Black people in Europe experience racial harassment. People of minority background continue being harassed on a daily basis. We're living in one of the most prosperous and most equitable societies. We cannot allow this to continue. And I don't want in 70 years to be holding a sign, I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit. Because to go back to what Mina said, there is a quote again by Martin Luther King, that riot is the language of the unheard. And that is exactly what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the unheard saying enough is enough of being unheard. And we need to start and listen.
Thank you very much, Antoinetta. Perhaps let's keep this conversation moving along, and I'll bring in a new topic. I want to ask you about the topic of statues and commemoration. This has come up as one of the major talking points from the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests. In the UK, in Bristol, the toppling of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston on June 7th seemingly catalysed a much wider debate on commemoration. And it's fair to say that many, many more statues and street names of individuals with a colonialist and racist past continue to mark Europe's streets, squares, and public spaces in general. Mina, perhaps I could come to you on this. What's your view on this phenomenon, and how, if at all, do you think the issue should be addressed moving forward? What do you see as the role of the EU and the EU citizens both on this issue and the Black Lives Matter's protests more broadly?
I think when it comes to this, we do need to acknowledge the influence that European colonial history has on our society today. And that means also in public spaces, be they museums, streets, city centers, and also our politics, of course. And so I think starting with the renaming of streets that are named after colonialists and slavers and the removal of statues is a good place to start. And I actually saw this, that the EUJS today retweeted their Austrian member about that are also calling for the removal of a statue of an anti-Semitic person in Austria. And so I think these are really important spaces. Now, I think some people will argue that you need to kind of have a explainer or like a contextualization plaque to kind of explain to people why this statue is put there and why people are protesting it and so on. But I think like some statues that are in the streets can belong in museums. You can put that plaque up in a museum and the people who want to see that can see that. But we don't need to see statues of slavers and colonialists in our streets. And I think this is a debate that has thankfully come to the fore now, thanks to the Black Lives Matter movements in Europe as well. But it is one that has been on the agenda for some years across Europe. And I remember in Berlin, there has been for a number of years campaigns to rename some streets that are racist, that have racist connotations in the names, that celebrate slavers, that celebrate colonialists. And we need to confront this history. And also we need to kind of have this active process of decolonization across a number of our systems. So starting from our education and beyond. And so we need to also, so I do hope that EU citizens take a role in pulling down statues. I do hope that political leaders take a role in pulling down statues and listening to the voices of the activists that have been talking about this for a number of years, and that this is coming to the fore now, and that's fantastic. And I mean, when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement in Europe, they have also been organizing for a number of years, and now this month particularly, of course, we are seeing more and more protests. And we must do everything we can to support and to listen and to learn and to also unlearn everything. But I mean, we have to start with even acknowledging the amount of colonialism and the impacts of the colonialism. That we need to acknowledge that Italy was a colonizer, that Spain has colonized, that Portugal has colonized, that the Netherlands have colonized, that Belgium has colonized, that France has colonized, that Germany has colonized, that the UK has colonized. We need to acknowledge what that means and what that continues to mean when countries continue to pay taxes to these EU nations, when the wealth of EU nations continues to be on the backs of countries in the African continent, when our museums are full of art and artifacts from other nations, and that these museums continue to profit from that art that has been stolen from others. I think all of this is an act of decolonization. And if it must start with removing statues in our squares, so be it. And I hope it continues, and I hope it becomes a stronger movement to decolonize Europe, and not just to tweet and hashtag on Instagram.
Go for it, Carlo.
Thank you, Ilan. Well, dear Mina, certainly there are some bridges that cannot be gapped right now in this debate, because I would certainly never encourage people to unrest. I would never encourage people to stop learning or stop studying or to turn their backs on our history. We have to accept our history with its goods and wrongs. We cannot turn our back on our history that is of course full of mistakes, but also I believe that if we are here, it's thanks to this history and we have to learn from these mistakes. We cannot start rewriting our past. We should start writing our future, and we should focus on the future rather than the past. I mean, where should we start with these monuments and statues and tearing down these historical historical monuments? Should we start with the Egyptian pyramids that were built on slavery? Should we start with the Aztec pyramids, a culture that, by the way, used to eat other members of their society, and rituals of human human rituals where people would be killed because of a god? Where should we start? Where is the limit?
We should start with Europe because we're Europeans. We should start with Europe and look to Europe instead of sidelining the conversation and start talking about other cultures and other countries where we have no say. Let's start with Europe and looking to Europe.
Can I also add something to the whole erasure of history part?
Be teared down. The Coliseum in Rome should be teared down. Louvre should be teared down. So no, seriously, is all of our art that was made in times where slavery was part of our history and was part of the society in that times, everything should be burned? I mean, because this reminds me of a different period of time in Europe where people would burn books. Sorry, Michelle.
No, I just wanted to say, like, as actually someone who studies history, I actually am a fan of people like tearing down those statues, because like, who decides what is our history in the first place, and whose history gets written down and whose voices are heard in a society? I mean, it's the people that are in power. And I think what we see right now and what we've seen like hundreds of years ago, like minorities and especially people of color, indigenous people, Black people, they were not in positions of power because they were exploited by systems of oppression that are still operating in Europe and on a global level, and that have to be fought also on a European and on a global level. And I think this is why we see also like the movements reaching out from the US to Europe, because there's a connection of like a racialized experience there for a lot of people. And yeah, so I think this is not like a moment to erase history, but like rewrite it and rethink like, what do we teach in schools? Like, whose stories are told? And I think it is on us also to it's on us also to rethink that, and yeah, and to also step back and share our platform that we have as activists with activists of color and Black activists. And I can say for my organizations, we also have a long way to go, because we do not have that representation of those groups that we would like to have. And I think it is on us to also yeah, like realize why is this the case, and how can we be more inclusive, and to come to like the future. I think issues that we have to talk about in Europe are not only like the curriculum in schools and how we can work on this decolonization, but also practices like racial profiling that we haven't spoken about during this debate before, but it's happening, and we have like systemic racism in the police departments. It's not only like a US-based problem. We have, I mean, I'm from USUS, I'm from a German organization, and I can say that there are there have been like 150 deaths in custody, like in the last like 15 years or so, of Black people and people of color. And I think these are the topics that we should be talking about right now. And I'm very glad that those activists in the US have actually like sparked those conversations, because I think it is also not just like a one-time event. It's like the result of years of organizing of a lot of people. So I'm very glad and thankful that we're having those conversations right now.
Michelle,
if you allow me to continue.
Carlo, yeah, I'll pass over to Antonetta, and Carlo, I'll give you a chance after for any comments.
So if you allow me to continue on that line, first of every time we talk about minorities and discrimination and inequalities, the whataboutism comes up. You know, what about that other issue? And what about those other people? And what about this? And what about that? The removing monuments of people that have had a clearly racist background does not erase history. Otherwise, I can remember of one particular person that was all over Europe and is all over our history, and yet I don't see Hitler's monuments all over Europe. I don't think this erases history. It's just disrespectful to think that we're not grown up enough as societies to recognize what was a mistake and not glorify those mistakes, because this is what monuments are. They're a glorification of what a person did with throughout their lives. And if you just keep those monuments glorifying people that nowadays we can all agree, I believe, didn't do the right thing, then I mean, sorry, why do we have Google for? If you really want to know about a certain very racist or very oppressive person, just go and Google it. You don't have to shove it in the face of the people that were stomped over from that person. So no, I honestly don't agree. But when we come back to Black Lives Matter, I think the protests have done as a direct consequence that one thing that, you know, the Confederate flags and the Confederate monuments, for example, in the US, have been a topic that is debated over and over, the removal of those monuments and so on. And every single time the topic was spurred in the US discourse, you know, the same line was held, you know, it's still part of our history, so let's see, let's weigh the options, let's do a study about it and whatever. And now, as a result of that wave, you know, they're starting to remove it. So people really are opening up to the idea that systemic racism needs to be tackled. It's the 21st century after all. So let's not keep the mistakes in public display. Let's find a way to tackle them. Otherwise, we will keep stomping on in the same place and achieve nothing in the end. I wanted to give an example. I read that actually the 5 most purchased books on Amazon and Barnes and Noble in the US are books that are dealing exactly with systemic racism. That is a good sign. People having those debates, that's a very good sign. The fact that just a few weeks ago, when the Blackout Tuesday was going on, in order to not flood with the hashtag Black Lives Matter, a lot of people, including me, put, you know, hashtag everyone matters or all lives matter. And then that debate was spurred about, well, you know, you think that you want to say that Islamophobia is also an issue, but what you're doing is again redirecting the attention of the actual problem at hand, and that is that we have systemic racism in the most developed societies. We have done a lot, but just on paper. We need to make that last step, and we need to start with the display of such offensive statues.
Thanks, Antonetta. And Carlo, I said that I want to come back to you. Perhaps if I can ask you to keep it brief before we move on to our final few items.
I'll do my best, Alan, but I have 3 people to reply at, and they had one single voice and 3 times the time I had. So I try to be as brief as possible. But Michelle, if you have studied history, you will know that in the past, it didn't mean that being a black, white, heterosexual Catholic meant that you were rich and that you had hundreds of slaves. Actually, the people that were in power 300 years ago, it was just one single family in each country, in each kingdom, and the rest of them were all well, equally slaves, or maybe not equally slaves, but you cannot say that the past represents the oppression of the white man. This is to simplify our history. I don't think that we can simplify our history. Do you think, Antoinetta, that if we go to Rome, you will start, craving again for the Roman Empire? I don't know. If you go and you pass through Julius Caesar statue in Rome, you will start craving again for this political system. What should we do? Should we burn the rest of Europe? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because when I listen to you guys, I'm honestly astonished.
Well, how about we then put some monuments of Hitler, because, you know, he's part of history too, and people should know that he was part of history. How about, you know, we build a monument of Franco in the middle of Madrid?
No. This is not the right answer. First of all, because Second World War is very close to our history. My father is a survivor of the Second World War. I also have Jewish family. I will never accept something like that. Instead of this, I believe that we could raise more monuments for the Jewish communities in Europe that are still suffering from anti-Semitism. I agree on that. I agree that.
I'm sorry, but are you saying that the person that was selling slaves and killed millions of people, or okay, hundreds of people by sinking a ship full of, you know, living people, is less of a crime than, you know, people being killed because they're Jews? Because I don't see what you're trying to say here.
What I am saying is that there is people interested in, first of all, glorifying vandalism and the killing of police officers. And second of all, I'm saying that there's people trying to make us look the other way when there are very important things happening in our world. If you really want to tackle history and historical monuments that represent something terrible, why don't we tear down the Soviet war memorial that is in the center, in the heart of Vienna? Why don't we go there and we tear down this monument that still represents the history of an ideology that has killed at least 100 million in the last century? Why don't we do that as well?
Thanks, Carlo. I guess we'll keep these as rhetorical questions for the time being and move forward with the conversation. And Carlo, you mentioned the topic of anti-Semitism, and it's an issue clearly high on the agenda of EUGS. Now, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism has been an important tool in the fight against anti-Jew hatred. The need for minority groups to be the ones to define the hate targeted at themselves is clear, whether that be the LGBTQI+ community defining homophobia, the Muslim community defining Islamophobia, or indeed the Jewish community defining anti-Semitism, and so on. Therefore, I would like to ask each of you what your current position is in the organisation on the IRA definition, and what steps your organisation would take towards adopting this, the widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism. Antoinetta, if we do the reverse order, then perhaps I'll start with you.
I have to say that unfortunately, in the middle of what you were saying, it froze, so I'm not really certain what the question was.
Sure. So the question is surrounding the generally accepted IRA definition on anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition on anti-Semitism, the widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism that exists. And I was wondering, a lot of organizations, football teams, governments, and civil society organizations have been adopting this definition as a marker to define how to combat anti-Semitism wherever it manifests. And I was wondering what steps your organization would have taken towards adopting this, and your current policy or position on anti-Semitism.
Well, the fact that we need to discuss this clearly brings us to the point that we were discussing this whole time, that the fact that we need to discuss what exactly the definition of anti-Semitism is, brings us to it being still a very widespread phenomena. I can remember even here in Belgium, some time ago, there was this incident with football fans chanting anti-Semitic statements. So yeah, it's quite obvious that we need to adhere and adopt the appropriate wording when it comes to tackling the issue, because there are European Parliament reports on the matter. We need to act on every level that is possible. As youth organizations, it's a phenomena that is, I think, cross-party share, that we need to tackle those events and adopt the appropriate wording in order to act properly. I'm really sorry. I'm not really still sure what exactly your question was, because my connection became unstable and I could only hear fragments, so I can imagine what you asked me. But I do think it's an extremely important thing that we stick to the facts, that we stick to definitions, and that we do the right thing. It is the 21st century, and we're supposed to be, progressive, because we're the young people.
Thank you, Antonietta. Carlo?
Well, Alan, of course, in EDS, we don't have a dictionary where we put operating definitions. Nonetheless, of course, to us, anti-Semitism in Europe right now is a growing movement that we cannot accept, that we need to fight. And this is terrible news that we are seeing movements like the BDS boycott on the Israel state going on here. For example, in Spain, the Socialist Party has adopted I don't know how many motions and resolutions in regional plenaries or in the national parliament in favor of this terrible boycott that is only hiding one of the many ways of anti-Semitism. We cannot accept that the modern anti-Semit movements try to call themselves anti-Zionist. I believe that there is no difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. The Jewish heritage in Europe is something that we have to preserve. And when we talk about history and monuments, rather tearing down some monuments that you dislike, what I suggest is that we protect the European Jewish heritage that we have in Europe and that has been vandalized over and over in the course of the last couple of centuries in Europe. And this is one of the many things that we could say regarding anti-Semitism. In France, there are too many anti-Semitic attacks on schools every year. There are a lot of religious sites that are still boycotted and vandalized every year across Europe. And this is something that we cannot tolerate anymore. And this is definitely something that I would love to bring up to the parliament for a common resolution together with my colleagues here. And I hope that we can find common ground. But I have to say that it is very difficult to work with certain political families with regards of Israel and the current situation of the Jewish communities in Europe. It is becoming harder and harder, and this is something that scares us a lot.
Absolutely, Carlo. And in fact, our last question is indeed on the topic of BDS. So thanks for making that segue. Michelle, I'll come to you on the topic of anti-Semitism before we talk about BDS and specifically.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a tricky one, not the anti-Semitism one, but the BDS one. Considering, I mean, when we're talking about the definition, I don't think we've adopted it, but I think we would definitely find a majority for it, let's say. And I mean, as I'm someone coming from Jusos, and as someone who has also seen the attack on Halle, which was last year, and an increase in attacks on Jewish institutions and Jewish individuals, not only in Germany, but I think we can say this in Europe as a whole. I think this is very horrifying that we see this increase, but I think there's also, of course, a correlation to some parties that are also in the European Parliament who are spreading anti-Semitism. And we've seen it also like during the Corona pandemic that we've seen anti-Semitic, that basically like Jewish people, that there were fake news and Jewish people were blamed also for spreading the virus and stuff like this. And I think this says a lot about where as a society we are right now, and that we still have to combat racism and anti-Semitism. And I think the place where we would definitely or will definitely discuss it is our network that I've mentioned before, where we're talking about like the extreme right and combating racism and anti-Semitism. So and on BDS, I actually have to say like we are very divided when it comes to this issue within our organization, because for my organization, for Jusos, I could say that we condemn BDS. But of course, there are other organizations within the umbrella organization that have a different point of view on this. And so very, very much divided on this, to be honest.
Thanks, Michelle. And as I say, we will come back to BDS, but Mina, if I could ask you specifically on anti-Semitism at the moment.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I giggled a bit when Carlo Giacomo said that he hopes that these European families could come together for definition, because to be totally honest, sometimes our own organizations don't have a common understanding. And I think it's important to be very clear and very transparent on this, because we're talking about the need to unlearn, but also the need to kind of understand our role. And I think the working definition of anti-Semitism is one that also brings up many discussions. On behalf of FOIG, I can say that we have been, as I mentioned earlier in the call, and I was wondering if we'd get into it, since 2015, we have been actively working on this. And I mean, particularly, we've been actively working and with our member organizations on the issue of Israel-Palestine and the protracted conflict there, and how, as a young green European family, we should react to that and respond to that. From our own documents, I can quote that we define ourselves as Antifa, as anti-fascist, and are in solidarity with the anti-fascist movement. This is extremely important to us and core to who we are and how we stand on many issues. But also, like, again, one of those core discussions, which obviously you're going to be familiar with, Ilan, is that it's many anti-Semitists will be hiding behind their criticisms of Israel, and so we should make sure that the definition doesn't prevent progressive voices from criticizing the politics of the Israeli government and prevent violations of fundamental rights in Israel and Palestine. And this is important to us. But as for adopting any definition, like the other political families here, I can say that we have not. And that is because as a political family, we do have continuous conversations and discussions and debates around this. And we try to keep updated as much as possible. So I think it's really clear to be as transparent here as possible on this.
Thank you, Mina. And perhaps if I can just mention, you mentioned the fact that it's important that the definitions don't impede debate and open debate and criticism of Israeli governments. And that's precisely why the Jewish organizations around the world are such a strong advocate of the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism, precisely because it provides this space for criticism, whilst clearly defining the line where, as Carlo alluded to before, where anti-Zionism steps in and anti-Semitism is seen. So thank you for your comments on that, and perhaps we can move on to another item. So at EUJS and the overwhelming majority of mainstream Jewish organizations, the BDS movement is considered anti-Semitic. The impact that a boycott of Israel would have on the provision of kosher food, academic freedom, and cultural pluralism is a vitally serious issue, both for Jewish students in Europe and Jewish communities in general. Moreover, the BDS movement, while claiming to oppose Israel's policies, targets its hateful rhetoric not at Israel, but rather at Jews, holding Jews collectively responsible for Israeli actions. On this topic, I would be interested to know your organization's view on the discussion surrounding specifically the boycott of Israel. Mina, perhaps I could start with you on this, given that, as you've alluded to, the policy papers and resolutions passed by the Young European Greens. In 2018, the Federation of Young European Greens passed a resolution which called for an end to the EU-Israel Association Agreement, an end to the EU's military cooperation with Israel. It called for an arms embargo, on all forms of security equipment to be placed on Israel. And it also called for the promotion of divestment from Israeli public bodies. I'd be interested to know your views on
more
this.
about this, absolutely.
And perhaps if I could make one more point, it's very interesting to note that your member organization, the German Greens, distanced themselves from this resolution.
Yes. That was a big and long, of course, conversation, and continues to be a protracted conversation as well. I think that in terms of the last point that you raised on FYG's resolution, we think that Israel should not be treated as a priority partner for the EU. This is because of, well, EU's fundamental values. It is unacceptable for the EU to economically support a system of illegal military oppression and segregation. And as many European states provide the Israeli regime with resources used against civilians and peaceful demonstrators, particularly in the occupied West Bank, like we particularly stand here that this is not acceptable to have this cooperation, because there must be common values and we don't see them thus far. So as for directly with in response to your question on BDS, we don't have specific statements or resolutions that bring this up. However, Greens are a nonviolent organization, and so we are for using peaceful ways to tackle humanitarian issues and violations of human rights. Boycott has been an important tool in the past. For example, to fight against the ruling of Pinochet or apartheid in South Africa. At the same time, we should be careful with boycotting as a kind of go-to, as a go-to for kind of political action. I think there are other ways to deal with this. So that's what I can say in terms of what FYG's policy and resolution so far have covered. And as you rightly stated, the German Greens, the young German Greens, have not supported our most parts of our latest resolution and bring up the debate most often. And I think this is important to also note the space for differing political opinions also within the young Greens.
Carlo, I think you had a comment on this.
Yes, I believe that there were some outrageous things that have been said. First of all, for me, it is surprising that democratic organizations still cannot understand that anti-Zionism is a different way of anti-Semitism. Secondly, the state of Israel is definitely the only state in the Middle East that respects minority rights, and I am surprised that there are organizations that want to boycott the only political entity, the only state in the Middle East that can respect the minority rights. While we have a lot of things going on in the Middle East, it shouldn't be a priority to boycott Israel. It shouldn't be a priority to help anti-Semitism to rise, but we should rather help Israel, and we should help other communities like the young Lebanese that are fighting for democracy in the Middle East, or also other countries. For me, it is very important that Europe goes global and that we take a stance also in global issues. And Latin America has been mentioned. It is, surprising that again and again, there are some political groups in the European Parliament that fail at condemning Venezuela and Cuba, that are not only racist political systems in place, but also places where anti-Semitic organizations and terror organizations get funds and get training. And this is something that for our fight on terror should be a priority number one. And also for our fight for democracy and for freedom, we should help our allies. Israel is an ally of Europe, and for EBS, it is certainly a top priority that the European Union and Israel can get along and can cooperate, especially in the Middle East, because we have terrible situations in the southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. It is very nice and cool to go marching because of the terrible murder of George Floyd, but no one marched when we saw the videos of the slave trade that is going on in Libya, which is much closer to us, by the way, and where there is no rule of law and no one has been arrested. And this is why I am really surprised, and I expected a different kind of approach from these three young ladies that are very nice and that sustain democracy. But I cannot understand how there is still so much anger and so much hate in some of the organizations. And I am sure that you are here only representing the official position of your organizations, but I would expect more help in helping Israel to fight anti-Semitism and to defend minority rights across the Middle East.
Thank you, Carlo. And Mina has something to add on this. I'll briefly go back to Mina before going to Michelle and Antoinetta on the topic of BDS, if that's all right. So Mina, over to you.
As a Southern Mediterranean, I'm from Malta myself. I think it's so important to bring up what's happening on the Southern Mediterranean shore. What we were talking about earlier as well, the European policy on migration is killing hundreds of thousands of people who are trying to migrate to Europe. And it's so important to bring this up. To say that no one has marched or no one has collectively responded to this failure by our state, by European states to save lives and center European values is incorrect. There are protests happening, there are campaigns happening led by Europeans also in response to the failure of Europe in the Mediterranean, be it the central Mediterranean route from Libya to Malta or Italy, be it the eastern Mediterranean route from Turkey to Greece, or the Western Mediterranean route from Morocco into Spain. We see a lot of response from NGOs. Earlier, Michelle talked about the support for also NGOs that save lives at sea, that are doing crucial work. I think we should also talk about this, and that these NGOs, these lifesavers, should not be criminalized. And the only reason why they are doing their work is because Europe is not. And so it's important to talk about this. And absolutely, when we talk about Black Lives Matter in the EU, when we listen to our political leaders talk about Black Lives Matter and support Black Lives Matter as if they have, and they are the same ones who have never supported the lives of migrants at sea, dying at sea. I mean, this is really important to call out. So I think it's great that that has been raised. I just also want to add a small point. I think it's very dismissive to call people young ladies. But particularly for me, it is especially dismissive. Earlier on in this webinar, I referred that I'm a transgender person, and therefore you cannot assume my gender identity. I'm a trans non-binary person. I'm not a young lady. And I think, again, it's dismissive to consider our views, the views of the young ladies. I just wanted to say that briefly.
Thank you, Mina. Michelle, I'll come back to you and just remind you that if you could give your views and opinions on the BDS movement and where you think YES is on that debate at the moment.
Yeah, but maybe also to say that I totally agree with what Mina just said, because like after already mansplaining me history, after I've been studying this and thinking like, I have no idea, this is very, yeah. So I think we have the right also to be angry, because angry means progress. Concerning BDS, I've already said we're very much divided on this. I mean, our stand as an organization is like the two-state solution. the borders of 1967. We're, of course, also criticizing Israel for human rights violations. But of course, you have to make the differentiation between Jewish people and the Israeli state, between government and people. And I think what we're also doing is, I mean, we have member organizations from Israel and Palestine, which means we're very much like working with them on the resolutions. And I think one of the major things is also like we have to support them as progressive actors right now in this country, where there is not a lot of space and platforms for these progressive groups on the political spectrum right now. So this is what I would have to say. But I think like the BDS issue will come up at the next Congress. We will see when this will happen because of this pandemic. But yeah, so you will probably have like a new take of us on this issue soon.
Thanks, Michelle. And I would also just like to point out that EUGS also supports a negotiated two-state solution. However, it is important to also point out that BDS and a two-state solution are perhaps two incompatible concepts based off the fact that Omar Barghouti, co-founder of BDS, has repeatedly advocated for a one Palestinian state and counter to a peaceful two-state solution. Antoinetta, over to you.
Yes. Having heard all the answers of the previous question, I finally got all the pieces together as to what the question was. And to kind of answer both the previous question and this question, LIMEC, as the European Liberal Youth Organization, is the organization representing the liberal organizations in the EU and around. We have a sister organization, IFLERI, which is the Global Federation, the Global Liberal Federation. And this is more of a topic of their discourse. We rather deal with issues that are EU-centric or Europe-centric, not only EU. So what I can say is that we have a clear policy on, for example, using trade as a tool to, achieving more peace in the world, but that's a far stretch to be able to get an answer to your direct question here, as we don't have strict policy on this. It's in the domain of our global liberal organization. However, I would like to mention something. With all respect, Carlo, you did it again. I mean, it's not the death of one Black person that is at hand here. We were all under quarantine and we had a heightened attention, and people nowadays record those things. That is the issue. The issue is that it is systemic. And yes, it is terrible. And thank you very much for bringing up, slave trade in Libya. But I mean, you just a moment ago explained how we should keep monuments of slave traders. So where is the line there? That I don't understand. Like, you either are for full equality and we move forward, or you're for it when it suits your rhetoric. That's what I don't get.
So moving forward is rewriting history. I'm lost here, and I never spoke in favor of slave trading. I mean, please don't get me wrong. I hope I'm understood correctly.
And also, can I add something to the Libya thing? Because yes, when you mentioned that no one is marching, I mean, our organizations, or some of the organizations that are represented here, have been working on this issue, like pushing their people in the parliament, pushing the commission on this, writing letters and everything. So I think it's very funny that you actually bring this up, because the Conservative parties in the European Parliament are doing nothing on this issue to actually close those torture camps that we're seeing. So I think what we would need from you is also support on this, and support from your party family.
Well, actually we are doing a lot. There is an agency called Frontex that is fighting against this criminal trade of human beings.
Guys, let's not throw shame at each other for our mother parties. They're a separate entity, you know, they take their own decisions.
I'm proud of my
the point is
party.
here of what we believe as youth
party.
organizations.
I'm not here.
I'll let you finish what you're saying before
without
we
name shaming. From the Limerick perspective.
Yeah, Carlo, over to you, and then
sorry.
Unfortunately, that's all we'll have time for.
Yeah. Well, I just want to make clear that I know what I say. I'm responsible for what I say, but if sometimes I'm not correctly understood, it is not necessarily my fault. And of course, there is people that want to understand what they want to understand. I am here to talk about minority rights. Why don't we talk about women in Iran, for example? Why are we still talking? I believe that in Europe, we have one of the biggest spaces of tolerance, and especially here in Spain, despite the many struggles that we still have, I'm sure that we are in one of the most tolerant countries in the world. Europe should export tolerance. We shouldn't export intolerance and hate speech. And this is something very important and dear to us, because democracy was not built over one day or over one night here in Europe. It was built after 2 world wars. It was built after a Holocaust, one of the worst and most terrible episodes in our human history. And of course, here you try to make the fun joke that, oh, because you don't want to take down the statues of Winston Churchill, then you want to put up statues of Hitler. No, this is not what we are talking about. We're talking, do we want to focus on the future? Do we want to focus on the real issues where there are countries where the minority rights are still not respected, where there is no democracy? Yeah, do we want to focus on them, on our future as a political entity, as the European Union, or do we want to keep talking about the past? Because if you want to keep talking about the past, definitely you cannot count on EDS. We are focused on the future. Our organization is focused on the student policies, because we need a future generation of leaders, of entrepreneurs, of doctors, of nurses, everything. We cannot stay focused on this. And I'm sorry if I am very straight sometimes, but I think that we need to move on, like Antoinetta said. And you should quote more often Mr. Macron, which is a phenomenal leader.
Thank you for your comments, Carlo. And unfortunately, that is all we have time for. I really enjoyed trying to moderate that discussion. It was certainly lively at times. And I'd encourage everyone watching to rewatch that and make your own minds up for yourselves. Thank you to Mina, Michelle, Antoinetta, and Carlo for being such great sports and for giving up so much of your time to participate in this discussion. Absolutely. And all that's left to say is thanks for watching, and please keep an eye on our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter pages for more updates and webinars. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.